Hey guys, thank you so much for being here. My name is Felicia from SweetGeorgia, and today we're going to talk about joining weft yarns as you're weaving. Now you can see on here I have this project. It's a half drill project. They're dish towels. I've been weaving this for a couple of weeks and they're almost ready to come off. But I got this question from one of the members of our School of SweetGeorgia and I wanted to share it here with you. And I thought I would use this opportunity to show you on the loom what I'm doing when I join new weft yarns. So Helen's question is, I feel like whenever I use a fiber that's new to me or a yarn weight that's different, I wonder what's the best way to join weft. Like, is there a difference between cotton and wool and superwash versus non-superwash? Mostly, I just want to avoid a disturbance in the pattern. I've seen videos of people who weave in their tails after they cut off the loom, videos where they splice, and videos where they just overlap. I suppose all are valid and have their place. So to answer Helen's question, I think yes, all of these methods can be valid. They can all have their place. It really all depends on what kind of yarn you're using for your weft, what kind of project you're making, and how you want it all to look. So in this dish towel project that I've been working on, I've been experimenting with a number of different ways of joining yarn. For the most part, when I weave and I'm joining yarns, I'll just do like a very simple tail tuck. So I'll cut off the yarn, or like if I'm running out of a bobbin, I'll use the end of that yarn and I'll tuck it into the same shed, sometimes around the floating selvage or around the outer thread, the outermost warp thread, and then tuck it back into the same shed and then down through the warp threads and then into the bottom. This is purely personal preference because I don't like seeing weft tails hanging out in front of me. I find it very disturbing to look at while I'm weaving. So I tuck all the tails so they're underneath my work and I don't have to look at them. Now, one of the things you might consider is that when you do this tail tuck, you are going to put your weft yarn back into the same shed and it's going to look a little bit thicker or a little bit doubled up. And so when you tuck it back into the same shed, you're going to see those two little weft lines. And depending on how thick your yarn is, that may or may not bother you. So that's point one. Now, the other point is that when you join the next yarn, what are you going to do? You're going to tuck that same tail in and then put it into the same shed. Now, if you were to put them on the same side of your project, then you're going to have what looks like 4 weft ends doubled up. And so I have an example of that on the loom here. I did do that very thing because I wanted to keep all of my color changes or all of my weft changes on one side of the project. Part of that reason is because of the way that I weave this particular structure. I have to do one weft pick and then one tabby pick and then one weft pick and one tabby pick. And I have a sort of a rhythm and a routine that I throw from the right to the left for the weft pick. And then I have a system for how all of these things are aligning. So if I started my weft yarn on the other side, then I would start to get confused about where I am in the sequence of weaving these 4 picks. So that's just purely personal preference. So again, I'll show you an example of what that looks like. 4 threads doubled up. It looks a little bit. Another thing that you could do if you're not bothered by being out of sequence or getting confused about which way you're throwing your weft and all that kind of stuff, then you could start your new yarn on the other side of your project. So you'd have a doubled up end on this side and a doubled up end on that side, and then it would kind of balance out. So it wouldn't bother as much. One other thing that you could do is, if you wanted to deal with it later, and I know some weavers who do this as well, is that they don't even tuck the tails. They just leave them hanging out and then just cut the yarn and leave them hanging out. And then after you pull the cloth off the loom, then you just take a needle and then you just weave in those ends and then just make it blend back into the pattern. So you just needle weave it back into your cloth. And for many people, that can help sort of tidy up those edges and make them look less obvious at the changes. But again, if you don't really want to do sort of threading a needle for each color change and then threading that in, then that's probably not the way that you want to go. You can see here with the magenta, I did not tuck the tail in. I just left it hanging out because I thought, well, I'm going to sew this in later to try to make it much less noticeable. But you can see it's just hanging out here. I actually don't really like this particular technique of just leaving the ends hanging out because as I'm weaving in the next yarn, this keeps getting caught up in the selvage edge as I'm weaving. So I prefer not to do this particular technique. So with this yarn here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm going to break this yarn and then tuck it into the same shed. shed I'm going to open is this one. No, it's this one. And then it's going around the floating selvage that I have here, and then down into my weft threads and into the bottom. So you can see it being tucked in right there. Then I'm going to add my tabby. Okay. Now I'm ready to add my next yarn. So you can just see that's what it looks like doubled up. I'm going to add my next color. So again here I am going to go into the shed, and with my new yarn I have my tail here, again going around the floating selvage that's out here, going down into the same shed, poking it down between those warp ends, and then tucking that in. Okay, and then I'm going to put my tabby thread in. So this is what it looks like when you do a color change on the same side of your work. You can see it's doubled up in this gold mustard color, and it's doubled up in the olive color. I'm going to weave a little bit more, and you can see how noticeable it is or is not. You can decide if you like it or not. So one of the things that I have been experimenting with is overlapping my yarns, overlapping the new weft yarn with the old weft yarn. And so in order for me to do that, I would pretend that I'm just continuing to weave along. So I wouldn't tuck my tail into the same shed. I would tuck it into the next shed, and then I would take my new yarn and then just overlap it for about ½ an inch or so, and then continue on. And so the end of the new yarn will be hanging about like this, and then the tail of the old yarn will be hanging like this, and they will overlap by about ½ an inch. And then when I take the cloth off of the loom, I can trim those ends a little bit, wash the cloth, wet finish the cloth, and then trim it again to get rid of all of those ends altogether. And so hopefully what will happen is that there's not any buildup at the selvage edge, and then there might be just about ½ an inch where there's doubled up weft thread. And I'm trying to keep that very close to the edges, but not the selvage edge. So maybe within 1 inch of the selvage, I'd have like a little ½ inch section where the two yarns are overlapping. So you can see that I did not have enough weft yarn on my bobbin. For some reason, there was like 2 lengths of this olive yarn on the bobbin. And so it's broken off right here, and I need to make a join. I'm not done with the olive, so I'm not doing a color change. I'm not changing out bobbins. I'm going to continue on as though I had never run out of yarn. So what I'm going to do is I've just finished this part of the sequence. I need to put in my tabby. And then the next time I need to use my olive, I'm going to tuck this into the next shed. Okay, so this is my next olive shed. Pretending like I'm weaving just as before. And then I'm going to overlap the two right here. Okay, so you can see I'm tucking in my tail. It's going into the next shed. It's just pretending to weave this olive color just as before. Now I'm going to put in my new weft yarn, and I'm going to take the tail and I'm going to pull it through about there. So you can see the tail is hanging out from underneath, and I am overlapping these 2 weft yarns, the old weft yarn and the new weft yarn. They are overlapping for about ½ an inch, 3/4 of an inch or so, and both of the tails are hanging out the bottom. And just because I don't like to look at tails. And then I'm going to lock it in with the tabby. So that's what it looks like. It's doubled up here in the weft yarn, but it's not doubled up at the selvage edge. So hopefully that's a little bit less noticeable. I'm going to weave this again. So hopefully it's not super noticeable. It just looks like a part where the green is a little bit thicker than the rest. Hopefully not too noticeable once you finish washing it. Okay, so as it so happens, it looks like I am weaving with a bobbin full of short weft lengths. So I ran out of yarn again on this side. And now I feel like this is too little yarn. It's not enough yarn to tuck in and make an effective join. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to break it about here and have the tail hanging down underneath the cloth, and I'm going to make a join where I overlap the two lengths as well. So in this case, that was this shed. So I'm going to take it out a little bit and poke it down here. So you can see here, I've just pulled it down to the bottom of my cloth, so the tail is hanging out underneath. Okay, I'm going to pop in my new bobbin, and then with this new bobbin, I'll just throw it in. So I'm going to take the end of my new weft thread, take the tail of that and pull that down below, and then I'm going to overlap the two, like so. Okay, so that is where the new yarn has been laid in. And then I just continue weaving as though nothing has happened. And there, that's another little join there. I have done in the past where I thought, oh, joins are not really noticeable, so I can just join in the middle of my cloth, because then I can get the most out of all of my weft yarn, just trying to maximize all of my yarn. And so I would make a join in the middle of the project, and it does look obvious. I feel like I can see it. Well, maybe it's only because I wove it so I can see it. Maybe other people can't see it, but I can see it. And then I just think, why did I make a join in the middle of my cloth? I should just keep it to the outside edges so that that'll become less noticeable. Now, to answer another part of this question from Helen, the idea of different yarn weights. What I'm using right here for this dish towel is 8/2 cotton. And so it is already on the finer side. And so the buildup of two weft threads together in the same shed, it's not really a big deal to me. It's not super noticeable. But if you were using a bulkier yarn, you were using a thicker yarn, then I would look at some other strategies for joining the yarn. So in this case, like I have here, this is a knitting yarn, but this is a worsted weight yarn. It's got 4 plies. And so I might do a join like I would do with knitting, where I would split the plies apart and maybe cut off 2 of the plies. And then with my new yarn, also remove 2 of the plies and then overlap the 2. So that way the part where there's the join has 4 plies, but 2 plies from the old yarn and 2 plies from the new yarn. And so that's something that I would take into consideration if I was weaving with a much thicker plied yarn. Now, in terms of material, fiber material, like if it's wool versus cotton, I don't think that there's going to be much of a difference in terms of the techniques that you would use for joining your weft yarn. But if you are very concerned about the yarn looking very obvious, or that there be a very obvious join, if you are working with a wool that was not superwash, you could maybe do a sort of a splice where you meld the two, or you kind of felt the two ends of the old yarn and the new yarn, you felt them together, and before you actually start weaving with them again. But I have never, ever done that because I just don't think it's really that necessary in the projects that we've done. For the most part, I just do that tail tuck, or I will overlap with the new yarn, and then when you go and you wet finish the project, it will provide the stability to hold all of those ends in place. So I've never found that there has been a problem with the ends wriggling out and then losing that weft yarn. Now, of course, when you make your joins, I always leave an extra tail, so that way when you go to wet finish it and all of the cloth kind of relaxes into position, it's going to suck up a little bit more of that yarn. So you want to make sure that there is a tail in order for it to kind of wiggle into the cloth. If you cut it too close to your cloth before you go to wet finish, it could wriggle out, and then you could be left with a hole where you're not getting very much coverage. So leave those ends until after you wet finish your cloth. So those are just a couple of the different ways that I go about joining weft yarn. Every project is a little bit different, and so I make this consideration as I'm weaving and think about the project that I have, think about what I'm going to be doing with the project afterwards, what will be more visible, what will be less visible. Obviously, it also depends on the project that you're making and how many color changes you might be having. Maybe they're more noticeable, maybe they're less noticeable, all of those kinds of considerations to make. Okay, so that is it for me today. Thank you so much for being here. I would love to hear about how you join your weft yarns. What's your favorite technique? You can tell me in the comments below. I read all the comments, and I'm so thankful that you guys are here to learn about weaving here with me as well. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next one. All right, bye for now.